Welcome to Family Shadows, where stories of sacrifice, betrayal, and redemption within families come alive. If these stories move you, inspire you, or remind you of the importance of gratitude, I invite you to subscribe so you never miss a new chapter in our journey together. Today's story is titled, "My son said investing was a waste, so I let him learn the hard way." Richard Hale was 65 years old, though his children often said he looked older than his age. He didn't dye his hair the way some men did, nor did he try to hide the deep creases along his face. Those lines, to him, weren't something to be erased. They were the record of a life lived with discipline, patience, and sacrifice. Each wrinkle was a story, of a mortgage finally paid off, of nights spent worrying about bills, of mornings when he packed his lunch instead of buying something fast and convenient because every dollar mattered. Richard had been a widower for nearly a decade. His wife, Margaret, had passed away quietly one winter morning, leaving behind 2 children who were already grown, but not yet wise. Since then, Richard's life had been a rhythm of routine, rising early, tending his small backyard garden, making simple breakfasts, and reading the financial section of the newspaper while sipping coffee that was never from an expensive cafe, but from the old percolator his wife once used. To his neighbors, he was the quiet man on the corner, the one who waved politely but never flaunted anything. To his children, Brian and Laura, he was the father who still wore the same jacket year after year, who drove a modest sedan instead of upgrading to something shiny and new. And to Richard himself, he was just a man trying to live in a way that honored both his late wife's memory and his own belief that life rewards patience. Richard believed in investing, not in flashy, short-lived schemes, but in the slow, steady kind. The kind of investing you don't brag about at dinner parties because it doesn't make headlines. Blue-chip stocks, bonds, index funds. His money grew the way trees grow, inch by inch, almost unnoticed, until one day you wake up and realize the branches can give shade. His son, Brian, never understood that. At 34, Brian lived fast. He liked sharp suits, new watches, and the thrill of telling people about the next big thing he was chasing. He would often say, "Dad, life's too short to wait 40 years for a payoff. You've been saving since before I was born, and for what? To live frugally while everyone else enjoys their lives." Laura, the younger one at 31, was softer in her words. She didn't mock her father, but she didn't defend him either. She lived in the city, worked in marketing, and often looked at her father's quiet lifestyle as something outdated, a relic of another generation. But Richard never let their views shake him. He had lived through too many storms to be swayed by his children's impatience. He remembered the inflation of the 70s, the dot-com bubble, the housing crash of 2008. He had seen fortunes evaporate overnight, and through it all, his slow and steady contributions kept moving forward, like a tortoise against a field of hares. On one cool Sunday afternoon, Richard sat at his kitchen table, balancing his checkbook. Yes, even in 2025, he still used pen and paper. The table was worn from years of meals and conversations, and the chair creaked under his weight. The window behind him was cracked open just enough to let in the sound of children playing down the street, laughter echoing the kind of innocence his own children once had. His ledger was neat, every figure carefully aligned. He noted the dividend payments that had arrived last week. To most people, they might have looked like tiny amounts, but Richard smiled as he saw them add up. Drops of water, he thought, make a river. When Brian arrived that evening for dinner, Richard could already sense the energy in the air. His son walked in briskly, tapping at his phone, a Bluetooth headset still hanging around his neck. He kissed his sister on the cheek, greeted his father with a distracted nod, and immediately launched into a story about a colleague who had just doubled his money in 6 months. Richard listened quietly, as he always did. He never interrupted. He had learned long ago that people, especially the young, often needed to hear themselves speak before they could hear anyone else. Finally, Brian turned his attention to his father. "Dad," he said, a smirk tugging at his lips, "you're still putting money into those slow old funds, right? Index this, bond that. Honestly, I don't get it. You've been at it for decades and you're still just you. No offense, but doesn't it feel like a waste?" The words hung in the air heavier than Brian intended. Laura looked down at her plate, pushing peas around with her fork, unwilling to take a side. Richard folded his hands on the table. He didn't respond right away. Silence, he had found, often carried more weight than words. He thought of his wife, of the way she would have squeezed his hand under the table in moments like this, silently telling him to stay calm. At last, Richard said quietly, "It doesn't feel like a waste to me." Brian chuckled, shaking his head. "Dad, you could have doubled, tripled your money by now if you had just taken a few risks. You play it too safe. That's why people end up with nothing. They are too cautious. Me, I'd rather live big even if I stumble a little." Richard didn't argue. He simply looked at his son and wondered how much stumbling it would take for Brian to learn that falling hurts more when you've climbed too high too quickly. The dinner ended with laughter from Brian, silence from Laura, and quiet reflection from Richard. That night, as Richard washed the dishes, he gazed at his backyard through the kitchen window. The tomato plants were sturdy, their vines climbing slowly up the stakes he had placed years ago. He thought of how they mirrored his life, patient, deliberate, steady. You water them each day and you don't see much change. But then one morning you find a ripe fruit hanging there, ready to be picked. Richard whispered softly to himself, words no one else could hear. Patience always bears fruit. Always. It would take time, but soon his son would learn that truth in the hardest way possible. Brian's laughter that evening lingered long after the plates were cleared away. He had a way of talking about money as if it were a game, one in which only the bold deserved to win. Safe to him was just another word for small. He leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on his phone, the other swirling his glass of wine, and said almost like a punchline, "You know what your problem is, Dad. You invest like it's still the 1980s. Nobody gets rich off bonds and index funds anymore. That's dinosaur stuff. You might as well bury cash in the backyard." Laura shifted uncomfortably, her fork scraping against the plate as if she wished she could erase the tension from the table. She had grown used to these moments, the way her brother teased their father. But tonight, Brian's words carried a sharper edge, like he wasn't just mocking a habit, but the very way their father had lived his entire life. Richard lifted his eyes and looked at his son. He didn't see the confident young man in front of him, the suit, the watch, the swagger. He saw the little boy who once clutched his hand crossing the street, who once saved coins in a piggy bank shaped like a baseball glove, who once asked with wide-eyed innocence, "Dad, how long does it take for money to grow?" That little boy had grown restless with waiting. Brian leaned forward now, elbows on the table, eyes glinting with the excitement of youth. "There's this project I've been following," he said, lowering his voice as if letting them in on a secret. "It's going to blow up. Real estate flipped in under 6 months. Crypto leverage, tech startups, you name it. Guys I know are already doubling their money. I'm talking serious returns, not the snail's pace dividend nonsense. The words serious returns hung in the air like a promise carved out of smoke. Laura bit her lip, caught between admiration and unease. She didn't like confrontation, but she admired Brian's confidence. He made risk sound like bravery. Richard's hand rested on the tablecloth, the veins prominent, skin weathered from years of labor and quiet sacrifice. He took a slow sip of water and then set the glass down. "Brian," he said softly, "fast money can vanish as quickly as it comes. It doesn't build a life. It builds an appetite, and appetites are never satisfied." Brian scoffed, shaking his head. "Dad, that's exactly why you'll never get it. You've been building your little nest egg for decades, and what do you have? A modest house, a small car, the same old jacket. You've lived like a monk. If you'd taken just half of what you put into those boring funds and put them into something bold, you'd be sitting on millions right now. Instead, you're sitting here telling me about patience. Patience doesn't pay the mortgage. Patience doesn't buy freedom." The word freedom stung in its irony. Richard wanted to tell him that patience was the very thing that bought freedom. The kind of freedom that didn't depend on whether markets soared or crashed, that didn't need constant chasing, that gave a man peace of mind when the storms came. But he held his tongue. He remembered something Margaret once told him. It was during the early years, when their savings seemed to grow so slowly it felt invisible. She had put her hand on his arm and said, "Richard, we're not planting for tomorrow. We're planting for a lifetime. The tree won't shade us yet, but one day our children will sit beneath it." He looked at Brian now and wondered if those words had been wasted, or if they were simply seeds still buried in soil too hard to let them sprout. The rest of dinner carried on in fragments, Laura asking about work, Brian scrolling through his phone between bites, Richard answering softly when spoken to. But beneath it all, a current of unspoken conflict swirled. A father's discipline versus a son's disdain. A lifetime of saving against a lifetime of chasing. When the meal ended, Brian stood, brushed crumbs from his lapel, and said with a grin that felt more like a challenge than a farewell, "You'll see, Dad, I'll prove you wrong. In a year's time, I'll be ahead of where you are after 40 years. Watch me." Richard said nothing. He only watched his son walk out into the night, confident footsteps echoing down the porch steps. Laura lingered behind, gathering dishes with a silence that spoke louder than words. She glanced at her father, wanting to say something, but the words never formed. She kissed his cheek gently before leaving, her eyes carrying a softness that her brothers could not. Alone again, Richard returned to the kitchen, rinsed the plates and stacked them neatly. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. As he dried his hands, he turned toward the small shelf by the refrigerator where Margaret's framed photo rested. Her smile, still young, still alive in the captured light of decades past, seemed to meet his eyes. "I suppose he has to learn," Richard whispered into the quiet, his voice carrying both sadness and certainty. And so the house settled into its silence once more. Outside, the streetlights hummed. Inside, a father kept faith in the lessons time had taught him, waiting for the day his son would discover that shortcuts often lead to cliffs. The following week, Brian's calls became more frequent, each one carrying the kind of excitement Richard remembered only from children on Christmas morning. His son spoke quickly, like he was afraid the opportunity would vanish if he didn't say the words fast enough. "Dad, you won't believe this," Brian said one night over the phone. his voice buzzing with adrenaline. "There's a new development project just outside the city. Prime land, condos going up, guaranteed resale within 6 months. The guys putting in money now are going to walk away with double. And that's just the start. I've got friends making real money on crypto plays too. A couple hundred here, 1,000 there. It snowballs fast if you're not afraid to jump in." Richard held the receiver to his ear, his thumb gently tracing the grooves of the cord as if the texture could ground him in the midst of his son's storm. He listened, patient as always, waiting for Brian to finish painting his castles in the air. Finally, Richard said, "It sounds exciting, son. But tell me what happens if the condos don't sell? What if the market dips?" Brian laughed, a sound both dismissive and pitying. "Dad, you've been reading too many old newspapers. Markets don't dip anymore, they rebound. And even if they did, that's the price of playing the game. You wouldn't understand. You've never taken a risk in your life." The words sank like a stone. Richard didn't argue, he didn't defend himself. He only murmured, "I've taken risks, Brian, just not the kind you think." But Brian wasn't listening. He was already talking about friends who had bought in early, about charts climbing upward, about dinners with people who wore expensive watches and toasted to future millions. When the call ended, Richard set the phone back in its cradle and stood for a long time in the quiet kitchen. He looked at the simple curtains Margaret had sewn years ago, still hanging though the fabric had faded. He thought about risk, how the real risk wasn't in the stock market or in property values, but in building a life on foundations too shallow to hold. Days passed, and soon Brian arrived at the house again, this time carrying printouts, charts, glossy brochures that promised wealth in bold fonts and bright images. He spread them across the dining table like a gambler laying out cards. "Look at this, Dad," he said, pointing at numbers with the same urgency he once used to point at toy catalogs when he was a boy. 200 grand in, 400 grand out, 6 months tops. If I leverage just a bit more, I could clear $500,000. $500,000, Dad. Do you know what that kind of money means? Richard studied the papers quietly. The pictures showed modern condos with rooftop pools, luxury gyms, glass windows gleaming in artificial light. He read the fine print, the clauses about projected returns, the disclaimers tucked into corners that few would bother to read. "It means," Richard said slowly, "you'll have more if everything goes right, but what if it doesn't?" Brian waved his hand. "You sound like a broken record. Nothing in life is certain, Dad. You either play it safe and die with pennies, or you take a chance and live big. I'm not going to end up like you, working all my life just to have enough." The words struck harder than Brian realized. Richard felt them like a cold wind through an old wound. Still, he didn't raise his voice. He only folded the brochure neatly and slid it back toward his son. "Brian," he said quietly, "I hope it works out for you, truly. But remember, every shortcut has a price." Brian smirked, pocketing the papers. "Well, then I'll pay it, but you'll see, Dad, this time I'm right." As he walked out the door, full of conviction, Richard stood in the doorway watching him go. There was pride in his posture, but also a weight pressing heavy on his chest. He knew his son was chasing shadows, grasping at illusions that promised light but so often delivered darkness. That night, Richard sat by the small lamp in his living room, ledger open once again. He wrote down his modest dividends, his quarterly gains, his simple interest. Nothing flashy, nothing to boast about, but steady, reliable. He thought of Brian and the line from Proverbs that Margaret once loved to repeat. Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. He closed the book, exhaled, and whispered into the empty room, little by little. Meanwhile, across the city, Brian raised a glass with friends at a crowded bar, laughter echoing against the walls. He was already celebrating wealth he had not yet earned, convinced the world was finally about to bend to his boldness. It started quietly, almost too quietly for Brian to notice. The first sign was a delayed update from the real estate developers, a vague email about minor construction setbacks and permits still under review. Brian brushed it off, telling himself every big project had hiccups. He still walked with confidence, still told his friends that soon, very soon, he'd be cashing in. But then the headlines shifted, markets trembled. A sudden dip in the housing sector, a ripple in the crypto world, whispers of instability where only weeks before there had been promises of growth. Brian checked his phone compulsively, refreshing apps late into the night, watching numbers that once soared begin to slide. At first, he told himself it was temporary. He repeated the mantras he had heard from online gurus. Buy the dip, stay confident. The market always comes back. He doubled down, putting more of his savings into coins he didn't fully understand, signing papers he barely skimmed. He told himself it was bravery. But bravery without wisdom is just another name for recklessness. Meanwhile, Richard watched from a distance. He didn't pry. He didn't lecture. But he saw the change in his son's eyes when Brian visited, dark circles from sleepless nights, a forced laugh where once there had been swagger. He noticed the way Brian avoided certain questions, how he grew restless at the dinner table, how he left early with excuses about meetings and phone calls. One evening, Brian arrived at his father's house unannounced. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled, his voice sharper than usual. He dropped into a chair at the kitchen table, hands running through his hair as if trying to hold his head together. "They pulled out," he muttered. Richard set down the mug of tea he had been holding. "Who pulled out?" "The investors, the developers, everyone. The condo project collapsed, permits never came through, financing dried up, and now the whole thing's frozen. My money's locked, Dad, gone, just like that." Richard said nothing. He knew his son didn't need judgment in that moment. He already carried the weight of failure on his shoulders. He simply let the silence stretch, giving Brian the space to feel what he needed to feel. But Brian wasn't done. He laughed bitterly, a sound more hollow than joyful. "And that's not all. The crypto plays tanked too. Coins I bought at the top are worth half now, maybe less. Everyone said it was the future, and I believed them. I thought I'd be sitting on a fortune by now. Instead, I'm sitting on debt, real debt." He dropped his head into his hands, and for the first time in years, Richard saw his son look not like a man but like the boy he once was, the boy who had scraped his knee on the playground and tried so hard not to cry until the pain broke him. Richard reached across the table, his weathered hand resting gently on his son's arm. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say, "You should have listened." He simply said, "I'm sorry, Brian, I know it hurts." Brian shook his head. "You don't get it, Dad. It's not just losing the money. It's the shame. I told everyone, friends, colleagues. I told them I was about to hit it big. I laughed at you. I called your way small, and now I'm the fool." The room fell quiet again. Outside, the crickets sang, the hum of the summer night pressing against the windows. Inside, a father and son sat across from each other, the air heavy with defeat. Richard stood after a moment, walking to the shelf where Margaret's picture rested. He looked at her gentle smile frozen in time, and whispered words only he could hear. "He's falling, Maggie. He's finally falling." Then he turned back to Brian, his voice steady, his gaze kind. "Son, falls are hard, but sometimes they are the only way we learn what ground feels like." Brian lifted his head, his eyes red, his face pale with the weight of what he had lost. "I don't know how to climb back from this, Dad. I don't even know where to start." And in that moment, Richard knew the time was nearing. The time to show his son that while fast money fades like smoke, slow roots run deep. But he also knew it was not yet the moment to reveal his hand. Not yet. The lesson had to ripen just like fruit on a vine. So he sat back down, folded his hands, and said only, "We'll figure it out." The phone rang late one night. Richard had already been asleep, the steady rhythm of an old man's routine lulling him into dreams. He reached for the receiver, groggy, only to hear Brian's voice on the other end, frantic, cracked, and nothing like the confident tone he had always carried. "Dad," he said, his breath unsteady. I need help." Richard sat up slowly, turning on the lamp beside his bed. The yellow light fell across the room, illuminating the quiet space filled with the memories of a life lived simply. Margaret's photo, his worn Bible, the glasses folded neatly on the nightstand. He cleared his throat. "What is it, son?" There was silence first, then a rush of words as if Brian had been holding them in for too long. "It's bad, Dad, worse than I told you. The real estate project, it's not just gone. I owe money on top of it, loans I can't cover, and the crypto collapse, it wiped me out. I don't even know the total anymore. Hundreds of thousands, maybe more. I'm drowning." Richard closed his eyes. He could almost feel the weight pressing on his son's shoulders, the same weight Brian had once mocked him for avoiding. "Dad," Brian continued, his voice breaking now, "I know I made mistakes. I laughed at you, I called your way small. I thought I knew better, but I don't. I don't know anything. I'm begging you, please, I need you to help me. Just a loan, something to get the collectors off my back. I'll pay you back, I promise." The desperation in his tone was sharper than any insult he had ever thrown. Richard heard not arrogance, not pride, but the stripped-down voice of a man who had hit the bottom and found nothing there to hold onto. He remembered the last time he had heard his son cry. Brian had been 9 years old, standing on the baseball field after striking out 3 times in a row. He had thrown his helmet down, tears streaming, shouting, "I'll never be good at anything." And Richard had walked onto the field, taken his son by the shoulders and told him, "Failure isn't the end, it's the teacher." Now, decades later, he heard the same brokenness in Brian's voice, but this time the stakes weren't a game, they were his entire life. "Come over," Richard said softly. Within the hour, Brian was at the house. He didn't look like himself. His once sharp suit was rumpled, his hair unkempt, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. He sat at the same kitchen table where only weeks before he had mocked his father's investments. Now he clutched his coffee like a lifeline, his hands trembling. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "I can't tell Laura, I can't tell anyone. They'll think I'm a failure, they'll laugh at me. I can't." He stopped, swallowing hard, his pride collapsing under the weight of reality. Richard studied his son. He wanted to reach across the table to take his pain away, but he knew that wasn't how lessons worked. You couldn't erase them, you could only live through them. "Brian," he said gently, "money lost can be rebuilt, but if you lose yourself, if you lose your faith in what matters, that's harder to recover." His son looked at him, eyes glistening. "But how? How do I start again? I've ruined everything." Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. He thought of the years he had lived with Margaret, the years of scrimping, saving, investing when everyone else was spending. He thought of the moments when they could have gambled but didn't, when patience had felt like weakness but proved itself as strength. "You start," Richard said, "by learning what not to do again." Brian lowered his head. "I don't deserve your help, not after everything I said to you. But please, Dad, I'm begging you. Just help me one last time." The plea hung in the air, raw and heavy, a son stripped of his pride and a father holding the wisdom of years. Richard knew the moment he had been waiting for was nearly here, the moment to show Brian that slow, steady choices bore the kind of fruit that storms could never destroy. But he also knew the reveal had to come when Brian was ready not just to hear, but to believe. So Richard reached across the table, laid his weathered hand over his son's shaking one, and said softly, "We'll talk tomorrow." And for the first time in years, Brian sat quietly beside his father, humbled not by wealth, but by the lack of it. The morning came with soft light filtering through the thin curtains of Richard's kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of wood polish that always lingered in the old house. Richard had risen early, as he always did, moving through his morning routine with the steady rhythm of habit. Brian, however, had hardly slept. He sat slumped at the table, dark circles under his eyes, staring into the untouched mug his father had poured for him. For once, the confident spark was gone. The man who used to speak of millions with a grin now looked like a child again, worn thin by mistakes too heavy for his shoulders. Richard took his time. He buttered toast, sliced a tomato from the garden, and set the plate down in front of his son. "Eat," he said simply. "It's harder to think on an empty stomach." Brian obeyed quietly, each bite mechanical, like he was just trying to fill the silence. When he was done, Richard wiped his hands on a towel and nodded toward the hallway. "Come with me." They walked slowly, father leading son, into the small study at the back of the house. It wasn't a grand room, just a desk, a bookshelf, and a filing cabinet that had been there for decades. Dust motes floated in the slant of morning light, and the chair creaked as Richard sat down. He pulled open the bottom drawer, reached inside, and lifted out a worn leather binder. Its edges were frayed, the clasp a little loose, but when Richard laid it on the desk and opened it, the papers inside were crisp, carefully arranged, every line of ink neat and deliberate. Brian frowned, leaning forward. "What's this?" "My life," Richard said quietly. Inside the binder were statements from brokerage accounts, retirement funds, dividend records. Each page bore the slow, steady markings of growth over decades. Modest contributions made month after month, year after year. At first the numbers were small, so small they might have seemed laughable to a younger man. But as the years passed, the figures grew. The trickle had become a stream, and the stream had become a river. Brian flipped through the pages, his eyes widening. The balances were not flashy, but they were undeniable. Hundreds of thousands across accounts, funds that had doubled and tripled over time. A portfolio diversified, balanced, and most importantly, intact. You had all this," Brian whispered. Richard nodded. Not from chasing, not from gambling, just from planting seeds and letting time do what time does best. Brian swallowed hard, shame rising in his chest. "And you never said anything, you never showed off. You just lived like you had nothing." Richard smiled faintly, lines deepening around his eyes. "Because wealth isn't for showing off, it's for living with peace. Your mother and I decided long ago that we didn't need to look rich to be secure. Every paycheck we saved a little. When we wanted something, we asked if we needed it or just wanted it. We skipped the shortcuts, Brian, because shortcuts rarely lead anywhere but cliffs." Brian's voice cracked. "Dad, I called you small. I laughed at you. And all this time, you were, he stopped, unable to finish. Steady, Richard said, finishing the sentence for him. Not flashy, not fast, just steady. And steady is what carries you through storms. The room was quiet except for the rustle of papers as Brian turned another page. He saw dividends reinvested, interest compounded, the invisible power of patience revealed in black and white. He thought of the nights he had spent refreshing stock apps, the heart-pounding thrill of gains, crushing despair of losses. His father had never needed that roller coaster. He had built something stronger by simply staying the course. Tears welled in Brian's eyes, unbidden and unwelcome. I don't deserve your help, not after the way I treated you. Richard reached across the desk, placing his hand on his son's. His palm was rough, the skin calloused from a lifetime of work. You're my son, he said softly. This isn't about deserving, it's about learning. Brian lowered his head, and for the first time in years he let the tears fall. He wasn't just crying for the money he had lost. He was crying for the pride that had blinded him, the arrogance that had led him astray, the years he had wasted chasing what his father had been quietly building all along. Richard closed the binder, the sound of the clasp snapping shut echoing like the final chord of a hymn. This isn't the end, Brian. It's just the beginning. The money you lost, it's gone. Let it go. But the lesson, if you hold onto it, it will be worth more than anything you will ever earn. Brian nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. For a long while they sat together in silence, father and son, old and young, wisdom and folly. And in that silence the seeds of something new were planted. Not wealth, not accounts, not balances, but humility, understanding, respect. The kind of legacy that no crash, no collapse, no market could ever take away. The binder lay closed on the desk, but its weight still lingered in the room. Brian stared at it as if it were some relic, not just paper and ink, but the sum of a life he had overlooked, a wisdom he had dismissed as outdated. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. The sound carried more than exhaustion, it carried surrender. All these years, he said slowly, I thought I was smarter than you. I thought the world had changed, that old rules didn't apply anymore. Everyone I listened to said you had to move fast, grab opportunities, take risks. I thought patience was just another word for fear. Richard didn't respond right away. He let his son speak, let the words pour out like water breaking through a dam. I mocked you, Brian continued. I mocked your car, your clothes, your simple life. I thought you were stuck in the past, but here you are steady, secure, untouched by the storms that swallowed me whole. And his voice broke. He pressed his palms to his face, ashamed. I built my house on sand. Richard reached for his glasses, slid them off, and polished the lenses with the edge of his sleeve. His movements were slow, deliberate, a reminder that wisdom often comes not in speed but in stillness. Brian, he said gently, every generation thinks the one before it doesn't understand. I thought the same about my father once. He saved in envelopes, tucked cash under floorboards. I told him he was foolish for not putting it in banks. He told me, son, I'm not trying to be clever, I'm just trying to be safe. Richard placed his glasses back on and looked directly at his son. Now here you are telling me I didn't understand. Maybe that's the way of things, each of us thinking we've discovered something new when in truth the old lessons are still the truest. Brian lowered his hands, his eyes red. So what do I do now? I've ruined my reputation. I've lost everything. How do I even begin to start over? Richard smiled softly. The kind of smile that comes from having walked through storms and finding your way to the other side. You begin the same way I did, the same way anyone does, little by little. You save. You invest not for today but for tomorrow. You cut back, you rebuild. It won't be fast, it won't be flashy, but it will last. Brian swallowed hard. The words felt heavy, but they also felt like a lifeline. They sat in silence for a moment until Richard added, almost as if speaking to himself, "Wealth is not about numbers in an account, Brian. It's about peace. It's about freedom from fear. I don't worry when markets dip. I don't panic when the news talks of crashes because I didn't gamble, I planted." The image struck Brian deeply. Planting, growing, the patience of the soil, the quiet work of roots hidden from view. For the first time, he understood why his father always tended his garden so carefully, why he seemed so content watering plants day after day. It wasn't just about tomatoes or flowers. It was about faith in slow, steady growth. Brian leaned forward, his voice quieter now, almost childlike. "I don't deserve to sit under the tree you planted." Richard shook his head. "That's where you're wrong. The tree was always for you and your sister. Margaret and I planted it so you would have shade even if you didn't understand where it came from. But Brian," his voice grew firmer now, "you must learn to plant your own, because one day your children will need shade too." The words pierced Brian's heart. He thought of his own son, barely 3 years old, asleep in a crib across town. He imagined his boy growing up, looking to him for guidance, for safety. What legacy would he leave? A father who gambled and lost, or a father who built slowly, steadily, a father whose discipline gave his child freedom? For the first time, Brian saw beyond himself. Tears filled his eyes again, but this time they weren't only for what he had lost, they were for what he still had left to build. "I want to learn," he whispered. "I want to do it the way you did. No shortcuts, just steady." Richard nodded, a quiet relief softening his face. "Then it's not too late. It's never too late to start again." They sat together in that small study as the morning light grew brighter, washing over the binder on the desk, over the father and son who, for the first time in years, weren't divided by pride or misunderstanding. They were simply two men, one who had walked the road and one who was finally ready to begin. And in that moment, Brian understood. The greatest wealth his father had wasn't in accounts or bonds or dividends. It was in the wisdom of a life lived with patience. The days that followed were quieter in the Hale household, but something had shifted in the silence. It was no longer the heavy silence of disappointment or shame. It was the steady quiet of rebuilding, the sound of a life being set back on track, one step at a time. Brian began visiting more often, not with boasts or promises, not with glossy brochures or quick tips whispered like secrets, but with notebooks in hand, ready to listen. He asked questions, not the kind meant to challenge or mock, but the kind a student asks a teacher when he has finally humbled himself before the lesson. Richard showed him the basics again: compounding, diversification, patience. He didn't overwhelm him with jargon or charts. Instead, he used the language of everyday life. "Think of it like your son's growth," Richard explained one afternoon while they walked in the garden. "You don't measure his height every hour. You don't panic if he doesn't grow an inch overnight. You feed him, care for him, and trust that in time he will stand tall. Money works the same way when treated with patience." Brian listened, really listened, in a way he never had before. He no longer rolled his eyes at his father's metaphors. He absorbed them, carried them with him, let them sink into the cracks pride had left behind. One evening, Richard sat at the same kitchen table where so much of their conflict had begun. Brian sat across from him, quieter than usual, his hands folded as though preparing for confession. "Dad," he said softly, "I used to think wealth meant having more than everyone else. Now I think it means having enough and knowing it's enough." Richard's lips curved into a small smile. "That's the lesson most people never learn, son. If you've learned it now, you're richer than you realize." Brian nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He thought of the long road ahead, the debts to settle, the discipline to rebuild. But he also thought of the foundation his father had given him, not just in money but in wisdom, in patience, in quiet strength. A week later, Laura visited, bringing her little boy to see his grandfather. She found the two men in the garden, bent side by side over the tomato plants. Richard's hands were steady, guiding Brian as he tied a vine gently to its stake. "What are you doing?" asked, amused. "Planting," Richard said simply. But to Brian, the word carried a new meaning now. He understood that what they were tending wasn't just tomatoes, it was legacy, it was discipline. It was the quiet, steady work of building something that lasts beyond yourself. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the yard in gold, Richard sat back in his chair, watching his children and grandson together. He felt a peace he hadn't felt in years, not because of money, not because of security, but because his son had finally understood. He thought of Margaret, of her words so long ago. "We're not planting for tomorrow, we're planting for a lifetime." And he whispered softly to the wind, "You were right, love." He finally seized the tree. The binder with account statements still rested in his study, but it no longer felt like the most important thing in the house. What mattered now was the seed planted in his son's heart, a seed watered by failure, nurtured by humility, and guided by a father's quiet hand. And so in the Hale family, the true wealth endured, not in dollars, not in markets, but in the legacy of discipline passed from one generation to the next. Thank you, dear listeners, for spending this time with Family Shadows. Stories like this remind us that the greatest wealth we can pass on is not always money. It's the lessons of patience, love, and resilience. I wish each of you health, peace, and the joy of a happy family. May your days be steady, your hearts be full, and your homes be filled with understanding. Until next time, take care and treasure the ones you love.